Selena from the International Rescue Committee, Sara and Samir. As has been said, of course, the refugees living in Nairobi face extremely challenging situations, much like the rest of the urban population. Clearly, Kenya is a country that since decolonization has seen its population increase by some sevenfold, and of course there has been a drive for many people from across the country to settle in its urban cities like the capital. Kenya's refugee camps, as has been mentioned by Sara, the Dadaab camps, agglomeration of 3 sites, were in total built to shelter 90,000 people, but now in total are home to some 270,000. So a major population increase due to the ongoing influxes from Somalia, and of course the authorities in the area have so far not permitted an additional 4th camp to be built, which has meant that refugees are living in those sites, of course, in very, very packed, almost urbanized environments themselves, despite being, of course, in the middle of the eastern desert. There has been, of course, in Kenya and many other countries, a great deal of pressure from the authorities, from donors, and from within the UN to work in a refugee camp environment. As has been mentioned, camps have positive aspects in terms of providing assistance, education, health care, and some measure of protection. But at the same time, as is increasingly recognized, there is a danger that the longer they are maintained, the possibility of a warehousing environment or other long-term challenges that are in many ways don't allow the refugees access to employment, to further education, and to other opportunities. I think now we'll open it up to questions, both from the audience here and from all of you watching on your computers. Please, when you take the microphone, for those of you in the audience, do identify your name and if you're from an institution or agency where you're from. And I think Liam will also be bringing material or notes from those watching online. A question over here, please.
Thank you. Well, I have 3 questions. I don't know whether I'm allowed 3 questions.
Well, if you could be very fast with your 3
this
questions.
Was not the first question. So, okay. So I apologize because I missed the first half an hour, and also I'm not by any means an expert in field. So I apologize for the naivety if the questions actually sound naive. But what is the difference between urban refugees or just a standard informal immigrants from another country? I mean, in other words, what are the special challenges that the refugees face that other people in urban Nairobi, even just urban poor in Nairobi, wouldn't face? The second question is, what do you see? I mean, I can see that there is a push factor involved in being a refugee. Obviously, you get to a camp not out of your choice. But then there seems to be here then a second stage of migration whereby basically these people are attracted more by pull factors to a specific place from the refugee camp. Now, is that from your study? Can you actually assess the extent to which these pull factors work in a similar way to the other types of migration, so the intra-country migration, whether people actually end up in Nairobi for different reasons to other normal migrants? And the third question is on the labor markets. You actually provided some anecdotal but quite striking evidence of the level of integration of these people into the labor market. So it sounds to me almost a similar debate to the kind of informal immigrants that we have over here in Europe, right? Lot of, very integrated, very important for local economy, but not recognized. Now, one reason why they are not actually recognized is because there is a strong incentive from the supply side of the economy, so from the employer, not recognizing them, because obviously that would increase the cost of employing such labor. That would increase the cost of getting this kind of service. So to what extent do you think that, and as until you don't address this issue, you can always work and try to make their lives better, but until I think you don't address this kind of perverse incentives, I think we are not gonna, get a durable solution to this kind of problem. Thanks.
Thank you. I wonder, Sara, would you like to?
Yeah,
would you like to perhaps field those? Or I can collect. Can we collect? There's a question up here. And just, are there any more right here? Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Ian Bust, formerly of what is now DFID,
now director of a couple of NGOs for some 20 years. I want to ask whether the selection of Eastleigh included the Mathare Valley villages, or whether they are now outside that area, because given their history and special social circumstances, I might expect different reactions in those to the arrival of immigrant peoples. Of course, partly depending on how many Somalis or whatever there might be already there. I think that might be useful. Otherwise, I rather agree with your point right at the beginning, that I see this as a general problem, which we've probably got just as much in this country as anywhere else.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder, Sarah, would you like to try to field those first questions, both on the definition of a refugee versus a migrant, and of course the issues of migration to Nairobi and labor integration?
Yeah. Not the definition, the implication of the different.
Yes, Samir covered that quite a bit at the beginning in terms of the particular challenges for refugees. Clearly, they're different from internally displaced, because not being a national of the country, there are immediate challenges when they move across the border, and that in the report we elaborate on the confusion, and we have mentioned it at the beginning, so I won't repeat it now, in terms of the difficulty, the confusion around their status as refugees brings in terms of protection implications and livelihoods implications. But I'd like to address in detail your question around the labor market and these perverse incentives, and I completely agree. It's the same problem here, the same problem as you were saying in many other countries. That's why we have decided to embark on this global study, for the next 3 years, looking at 15 different countries, and we've received funding for 8, and hopefully we'll receive funding for the additional case studies. But really looking at the dimension of displacement to urban areas, from the perspective of not just the displaced, but also the host communities and the interaction between them, and how you support from a legal perspective, and not just from a livelihoods perspective, the contribution that these people do provide to the economy. And yes, I agree with you. It is definitely there is a story behind of why the presence of illegal immigrants is not better formalized. But that's again an area where we think more work could be done by humanitarian organizations that work on protection issues, and already a number of them do provide a lot of legal aid support to organizations. But this is an area which is traditionally underfunded. Protection activities in many appeals don't receive quite as much money as assistance to camps receives. And that's pretty much what we think, that doing more research on this can highlight things that will also help us in the north address some of these challenges.
Do you want to speak about the issue of the migration, second stage migration?
Sure. Yes. I think in terms of the pull factors, I spoke briefly about some of the pull factors, and they are quite similar, if you like, from normal immigration in terms of, they are greater livelihoods opportunities, opportunities to get a job, opportunities maybe for further education, maybe potentially medical activities, but also the fact that a lot of refugees already have, networks within the city which they can tap into in terms of supporting their accommodation or supporting their livelihoods. But I think a key difference that I think we do have to highlight is that refugees are often, have fled kind of a situation of persecution or insecurity, so often do not want to be in the places where they are, but they are there out of necessity because they can no longer return home. And I think that's often kind of, when making comparisons, I think with kind of economic migrants, I think that's an important thing to remember. And I think with regards to the labour market, I think in terms of the incentives that you have here in terms of from employers of not formalising that labour because it provides a form of cheap employment, I think within the refugee context is slightly different, because in Nairobi I think you also have like a large urban poor that can provide that role. So I don't think necessarily having the between 50 and 100,000 extra refugees, I'm not sure what difference that makes in terms of the supply of cheap informal labour. But I think they're valid questions, and I think they're probably worth further exploration.
Are there any questions coming in from the internet as yet? No? I think there's a question over here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Paul Collins, editor of Public Administration and Development. I wanted to ask about the resourcing and financing, question and donors. I should mention I was an evaluator for EC not too long ago of proposals to EC by NGOs, quite large ones like, Minority Rights Group and Oxfam, for funding up to about €400,000 in each case for over 3 years for projects to deal with many of these issues, both in camps and in Nairobi slums, vis-à-vis many marginal groups in Kenyan society, which have increased as a result of the post-election violence and so on, And as a consultant, often you don't know what happens to your good works, And I was a bit worried hearing that there's been some decisions about not funding more stuff in urban areas, for example. So I'm wondering if anybody knows what happened to the EC funding, which was being offered, whether it's gone ahead in any cases. Maybe you're an applicant, I can't recall. Well, I shouldn't mention who was an applicant. But
No,
I mentioned two already, but I'm just curious to... I mean, there were very, very well formulated proposals, based on a lot of experience and research, which could have made a lot of impact in my view. And if they haven't gone ahead because of donor policy, which is not often very enlightened, frankly, or whatever,
Okay, well,
it's a
let
great
us see
shame.
if there's anyone who has any response to that.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the audience or anyone else out there in the land of streaming web? Any other questions here so far? Perhaps Selena, would you like to speak about the research and the grant proposal process?
Well, I can't speak in detail about the grant proposal process, I'm afraid, because I haven't been part of it. It wasn't the EU that stopped after partway through a programme. We are in the process of looking for more funding, and there's a lot of lip service is the wrong word, but there is the beginning of a lot of interest. Yeah. I don't know if donors accept how complicated this is and how much work still needs to be done in terms of research and pilot studies. I think it's a more difficult thing for a donor to fund than something for a refugee camp. But I think there is the beginnings of interest, but we need much more. I mean, I think there's also the new policies that are coming out. UNHCR have updated their policy. They also need resources to then implement those policies to turn that into reality. So we're at the beginning of a process, but we need a lot more.
Yeah, and
yes, exactly. Yes, Samir, would you like
to my
to
knowledge,
address
the
that?
Mathare villages were not included in the list. But it would be interesting maybe to hear why you think that the views would be quite different. It would be interesting to hear that maybe why you think some of the views might be quite different.
Sorry, I'll tell you later. The reason is, of course, all those villages were slum villages in the valley originally, with many different attitudes towards development and permanence, and different composition. Now, they moved on a lot, of course, in the 40 or 50 years since they were started, but I would have expected that there might remain differential attitudes towards newcomers, particularly in view of the burdens which the normal population now in those communities have got to face.
Well, we are doing a follow-up study in Nairobi, and that it's definitely something that would be worth exploring. We will start the broader study later this year, I think around May, June. But I also want to say that in this around the donor interest, I think the protection dialogue that the High Commissioner of UNHCR facilitated in December was a good start to provide further impetus to this interest by the donors, and it was two very good days of discussion on the challenges that refugees in urban areas do pose for the humanitarian community, and how it is essential that we develop strategies for humanitarian organizations to work more closely with our development partners and municipal authorities to think how to address these challenges, because we are in a context where, while we are more aware of some of the rights and challenges and problems of both, all vulnerable communities, be they refugees, displaced or host communities, to look at durable solutions, we need to work with the development partners that can work with the government long-term, think on how to support the involvement of these people in the economy and, strengthening their access to services and so forth.
And clearly it is, of course, a problem where the donor community has a great deal to do on the ground, but also to encourage other options for refugees, both supporting the host governments with opportunities for local integration, and of course providing places for resettlement. It is believed that the UK government is considering not undertaking any upcoming resettlement mission to Kenya this year, which would be a great shame because resettlement to the United Kingdom is just getting going. And of course in Kenya, the refugees who were traumatized in their flight from Somalia, Ethiopia, and other states in the region are very much amongst one of the key groups that UNHCR has identified worldwide. So clearly more resettlement opportunities are needed, and that's something that can be advocated for here. How about further questions from the audience here or online? I believe there's one here.
Thank you. My name's Jolene. I'm a program development researcher for Concordis International. I just came back from southern Sudan, and I spent a few weeks in Juba and a few weeks in Rumbek, where I met a few staff members of IRC. And I'm greatly concerned, actually, with the urban refugees in Juba, and especially with the street children, because they aren't really recognized yet as even as an existing marginalized group, and there don't seem to be any programs for the street kids other than a few personal initiatives that I visited. And I was wondering, I hope actually Juba will be part of the new research coming up. Could you maybe shed some light on, Sara, maybe about what's going on?
Okay. Yep. There's no other.
Are there any other questions as of yet? Yeah. Okay, yes, please.
Hi, my name's Katie. I'm from the LSE, and I'm actually helping do some consultancy on this thing, the exact topic for Khartoum. And I just wanted to touch on religious organisations and the role they play. You said that they're quite vital, and I know in Khartoum that's something that's definitely come up in my research. But you also said about policy recommendations you'd like to do, the RSC saying they'd like to do some work in sort of helping social cohesion. And is there sort of a contradiction in those two ideas? Is perhaps maybe like supplying or helping religious organisations, is that going to help or is that going to hinder that social cohesion? I just wondered what you were thinking about that in policy recommendations. Thank you.
Okay, interesting questions there. Sudan, a country with the largest population of internally displaced persons in the world, some 5 million internally displaced persons living in both cities like Khartoum, but also the southern cities like Juba and elsewhere, and of course also sheltering refugees from neighboring countries like the Central African Republic and Uganda and northern Congo. And of course questions on the integration aspects, which are vital both in urban areas like Nairobi and elsewhere. Perhaps Sara and Selena, you may have some input. Selena, on the South Sudan question?
More on the religious communities and building groups. Some of the areas we've looked at, I mean, I don't think there needs to be a contradiction between the two. You work with the situation you have. I mean, it varies from place to place. Obviously, in Khartoum, it would be very different from working in Nairobi, a whole different set of issues. But what we've been looking at is working to build groups that may exist only on an informal basis or may not exist at all, that bring the two groups together. So the women's groups, for example, that we talked about, work with both host populations and with refugees, so that there's not that line drawn. I mean, as we've said, they might have specific issues, but the urban poor have a huge number of issues too. And by working with them together, we can both address some of their concerns and create social cohesion. So that's the sort of projects that I think we're talking about.
And maybe on that, we actually, I wouldn't say that there's either a divide between the faith-based organisations and social cohesions, and I think particularly with the Great Lakes community, you know, kind of their participation in Kenyan churches was actually kind of like a great way of actually bringing them together and being seen as, or building relationships between the host community and those that were those that are refugees.
Obviously, integration being a big challenge. So these are developing countries with often real challenges meeting the health, education, labor, and social services needs for their national populations. Selena.
Sorry. Just to reply to the question from Concordis. Obviously, we wouldn't leave Sudan out of the studies. Me being involved, they've been, yes, difficult. Sudan is actually the first country we are working on this year together with Afghanistan. So the studies we have planned this year are Sudan, Afghanistan, Kenya, and Syria. And Sudan is started. The first study is ongoing now in Niala. We have a study in Juba planned for May, June, and one in Port Sudan. And we have one in Khartoum planned for June, July, and then we'll do one in EA later in the year. So there are 5 different case studies in Sudan. I'm not forgetting it. And yes, the challenge is there is going to be looking at the complexity of the issues, a mixture of refugees, IDPs, returnees, and the vulnerability of the host communities bring all together in a context where, both in the north and the south, legislation is vague or what is not vague is actually not very conducive to supporting durable solutions, where you have a plethora of different organizations working with very little coordination and coherence, and where in the South in particular, any sort of process of support in urban context is actually not welcome, because the policy is that the towns should go to the people, and clearly the people are coming to the towns. So we need to, again, the studies will hopefully spur a process of policy engagement with the authorities as well, to sort of think around the challenges that this really exponential growth in urban areas poses to the development of the country.
Are there more questions? Yes, there's one here. Any more as well? Please go ahead.
Joan Carey, IRC as well. Question for both HCR and ODI. When you talk about the percentage of urban refugees, are you including Palestinians in that figure? And for ODI, when you go into Syria, will you be looking at Palestinians as well as Iraqis?
Obviously, of course, in terms of the material that Samir put up earlier in his display, there are some 10 million refugees under UNHCR's mandate, of which perhaps half or even more are living outside refugee camp environments. Clearly, there is an additional group of refugees under the mandate of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Refugees in the Middle East, Palestinian refugees, that's UNRWA, and that number is some 5 million people, all of whom are in that immediate Middle East area, obviously in urban environments.
And yes, we will be looking at Palestinians as well, definitely. And we have a study planned in Gaza for next year. So next year we have Gaza, 2 studies in Iraq, I think it'll be Kirkuk and Mosul. Yemen or Somalia, we haven't quite decided on that. We're still discussing with our donor, and Jordan. So these are the studies we have funded, but we're still discussing funding for further studies in Colombia, Haiti, Pakistan. I'm forgetting, I can't remember. That's it. There are a few others, but yes, I mean the idea was also to do studies in India and in Brazil, looking at Rio and New Delhi, which again humanitarians wouldn't normally look at, but we feel the level of vulnerability and some of the vulnerability indicators in some of the slum areas of these cities are not dissimilar from level of vulnerability which would warrant a humanitarian response, and that's what we wanted to highlight. Now we haven't been able to mobilize funding, yes, because we are the humanitarian policy group and our traditional donors wouldn't see that as immediate in their remit, but I really hope that in the course of next year or the following one we can mobilize funding for this large metropolis, because I think it'd be very important to bring a comparative perspective from there.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Ian Buist again. Could I come back to a rather fundamental point? So long as people are in camps, they're in groups. The possibility of their returning, if return becomes possible, is administratively feasible. Once they go into the towns, they're individuals. And I can't see that it makes either administrative, financial, or other sense, other than to treat them, as intending to be integrated into those societies, of course retaining the choice individually to go back to their original countries if and when conditions change. Is that a correct analysis? because it does. It would. I can quite see why you have to. For administrative reasons, if no other, it is not sense to arrange schools for a whole group of, say, Somali women who are scattered over 2 or 3 locations. What you want to, because that's completely wrong. You must have something which is for all the children in that particular area, wherever they come from.
Right. Well, obviously it has been seen by the return of South African refugees from the Scandinavian countries when apartheid ended, the repatriation of course, millions of Afghan refugees from Peshawar, Islamabad, Quetta, as well as the refugee camps. It is possible to reach out to refugees, even though they live in urbanized settings, and facilitate their return. Often, of course, it's done in various ways, such as helping to cover some of their travel costs. Clearly, though, they're often expected to have some of their own means to cover some of their transport as well. But UNHCR, in the case of Kenya, has organized repatriation movements for Ugandan, Ethiopian, and other urbanized refugee groups who are returning, and great numbers in the past, of course, in the early and mid-1990s, the mid-1990s, Somalis in some cases were repatriated both from the camps on the Kenyan coast as well as those residing in Mombasa. Obviously, of course, it poses new challenges, but indeed it is possible, and it is done whenever necessary. Are there further questions from the audience or from the international audience?
Being quiet.
Can I just follow up on that question, actually? I think that's what we mean when we say there needs to be a serious conversation and some creative thinking about what is a durable solution. It is simpler in some ways in the short term to assist people when they're in one location where you have ready access to them, but that's not a long-term solution. You can't keep people living in that situation. So that's where we have to be creative, whether that means we then find a way to fully integrate people or find other alternatives, work permits rather than permanent visas, or other ways to integrate them. And that's the conversation that we want people to have.
But maybe just on that, I think also maybe from an administrative point of view, you could argue that camps are much easier because they are in groups and the repatriation could be easier. But I think from an ethical point of view, particularly if there is a protracted crisis and people are in camps we can't expect people to be in camps for 15, 20 years. And I think also within the 1951 Convention, it's quite clear that refugees do have the freedom to movement, and I think that it's in their right to be able to kind of go and seek livelihoods in the cities. Their their assistance and their protection shouldn't be determined by their location.
There's a question back here, and one here. Okay, good.
Thank you very much. My name is Judith. I'm also from Destin at LSE, a student. I was just wondering regarding the child and youth protection programs that IRC was running in Nairobi, and kind of linking to the last question, is that linked to other urban youth and children in Nairobi, or is that separate interventions solely targeting refugee children? Thank you.
No, they are targeting all children who the most vulnerable groups, so that wouldn't be determined by the fact that they're refugees. It's children in the informal employment sector, because they are exposed to a particular set of threats, and I don't know what the statistics are, but there's a good chance that they're going to include a large number of refugees because refugees are forced to work in the informal sector. But no, it won't only be refugees.
Please, yeah. Here's a mic.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Concordis again. I was wondering about the research that you conducted in Nairobi about the IDPs maybe, or people that have become displaced because of the post-electoral violence. Did you encounter them? What is their situation at the moment? What's been done about it?
Yeah, I mean, this study was particularly focused on refugees, and that's why, as Sara mentioned, we aim to kind of do an additional component to look at the kind of wider population. But I think in general there has been concern with regards to the post-election violence IDPs that although some have been returned, that there's some problems around the kind of durability of that return. And also, as with past displacement experiences within Kenya, there has been a tendency for IDPs to remain in the city due to continuing grievances, particularly around land issues and around access to land. And I think that remains a kind of a continuing problem. And I think in terms of the next elections. I mean, one of the key concerns in discussions with people in Nairobi is around, what will happen with the IDP populations, and will not resolving some of the issues that led to some of the displacement will actually create further violence in the next elections in 2012.
Are there further questions? If there aren't, I guess on behalf of researchers and all the panelists, once again, to thank all the researchers on the ground in Nairobi who hopefully are watching online for their incredible efforts in undertaking this very thorough study in the refugee hosting areas of Nairobi's capital and the surrounding countryside. To thank, of course, the Overseas Development Institute, the Refugee Consortium of Kenya, and of course the IRC for their work in contributing to the study, and of course to those fellow panelists today, Selena Brewer, Sara Pantuliano, and of course Samir Elharwary. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming.